Both President Trump and President Barack Obama challenged grousing lawmakers to step up and pass legislation if they did not like their signing of executive orders to pursue their policy goals. Doug Mills, The New York Times, Washington. The president was frustrated. Lawmakers were not passing what he wanted. They were obstructionists, he complained. So he took out his pen, signed his name to an order and took action on his own. We're taking a little different route than we had hoped because getting Congress, they forgot what their pledges were, he said. The chief executive attacking Congress was President Trump, but his words might have been spoken by President Barack Obama. Mr. Trump has concluded that he cannot wait for a polarized Congress to act, so he is turning to executive power to accomplish what lawmakers will not, in this case erasing the legacy of the Obama years. If the routes are similar, the intended destinations are radically different. Where Mr. Obama sealed a deal with Iran on his own, Mr. Trump on Friday took a step toward unraveling that agreement. Where Mr. Obama used executive power to bolster his healthcare program, Mr. Trump this week used it to undercut it. Where Mr. Obama created a legal status for immigrants brought illegally as children, Mr. Trump undid that. Mr. Trump's advisers argue that his reliance on executive authority was not a broader strategy but mainly a necessary response to remedy Mr. Obama's overreach. The previous president's actions were unlawful, unconstitutional, and these actions are largely reversing those actions, said Rod Shaw, the principal deputy White House press secretary. The former president's champions argue that the current president was fixated only on tearing down rather than building up. The fundamental difference is that President Obama used executive action to help the American people, and President Trump is using it to disadvantage large groups of people, said Bill Burton, who was Mr. Obama's principal deputy press secretary. But both presidents shared similar impatience with a balky Congress and a desire to take action when stalemated. And they both challenged grousing lawmakers to step up and pass legislation if they did not like it. By his final years in office, Mr. Obama had little hope that Congress would actually do that. But since leaving the White House, he has found that his executive actions were as a result sometimes ephemeral, easily reversed by the next president. Mr. Trump, whose Republican Party controls both the House and Senate, seems to be using his executive power in hopes of forcing lawmakers to act by creating outcomes that he knows many of them would prefer to avoid. In discussing his decision to cancel subsidies to insurance companies, Mr. Trump said on Friday that he hoped to compel Democrats to negotiate a compromise, now that he has failed to pass more sweeping legislation solely on the strength of the narrow Republican majorities. Now if the Democrats were smart, what they'd do is come and negotiate something where people could really get the kind of health care that they deserve, he told reporters. Similarly, in scrapping Mr. Obama's program to spare younger illegal immigrants from deportation on the grounds that it was unlawful for a president to create it on his own, Mr. Trump ordered a 6-month phase-out and challenged Congress to use that time to pass legislation authorizing the program. And in decertifying the Iran nuclear deal, Mr. Trump pressed Congress to come up with ways to curb Tehran's destabilizing activities before he pulls out of the agreement altogether. But Democrats were not in a negotiating mood, at least on Friday, soured by how a seeming alignment with Mr. Trump on the immigration issue was ruptured by subsequent White House demands for money for the president's wall on the southern border with Mexico and other hardline policies as trade-offs. They expressed more anger over Mr. Trump's healthcare actions, seeing them as deliberate efforts to sabotage the system to get Democrats to the table. What brings us to the table is trying to do some good for people, said Senator Chuck Schumer, Democrat of New York and the minority leader. But as in the past, threats and bullying is not going to work. In this politically, he's in much worse shape than we are. The American people, even a large number of Republicans, are on our side in terms of improving the system, not destroying it. And so I don't think he has much leverage to threaten or bully. William A. Galston, a former White House domestic policy aide to President Bill Clinton, said Democrats were unlikely to respond to Mr. Trump's pressure tactic. It's equivalent to hitting a mule over the head with a 2x4 and then expecting it to nuzzle up to you, he said. In the current climate, it's difficult for me to believe that Democrats are going to come running to Trump and say, okay, let's negotiate now on health care. I just don't see that happening. Enforcing the issue on healthcare, Mr. Trump may have scuttled bipartisan talks already underway about legislation intended to stabilize the insurance markets under Mr. Obama's Affordable Care Act. He also scrambled the congressional agenda at a time when lawmakers face several big tests in coming weeks. Congress is already struggling to restore funding for a children's healthcare program that expired, and it faces a December 8 deadline to finance government operations across the board. The immigration program will expire in the new year without action, and at some point around then lawmakers will have to increase the debt ceiling or face default. Mr. Trump also faces obstacles to pushing through his major tax cut program by the end of the year. And his Iran decision on Friday starts a 60-day clock for lawmakers to consider reimposing sanctions on Tehran, a move that would effectively blow up the nuclear agreement. Aides to the president said there was no concerted effort to use executive power all at once to move his agenda forward, and that each decision was driven by separate timetables, some of them according to various legal calendars. But they also noted that Congress in recent years has demonstrated that it rarely takes difficult decisions unless it faces deadlines with dire consequences for inaction, such as a government shutdown. Mr. Trump was a harsh critic of Mr. Obama for relying too much on executive power to enact his agenda, but has aggressively wielded his own executive pen since taking office. He has reversed environmental rules and other regulations on businesses, approved the Keystone XL pipeline that Mr. Obama had rejected, and walked away from a major Asian trade agreement and the Paris Climate Change Pact negotiated by his predecessor. Mr. Obama, by contrast, did not turn to executive power so robustly until later in his 8-year presidency, when the opposition was in charge of first the House and then later the Senate. For his first 2 years, when his own Democrats were in charge of Congress, Mr. Obama passed major legislation like his healthcare program, a major economic stimulus package and Wall Street regulations. What's remarkable is how early in his administration President Trump is resorting to executive unilateralism, said Mr. Galston, now a Brookings Institution scholar. That speaks volumes about the difference between being a majority party and being a governing party, which reflects in part the terms under which Trump won the nomination and the presidency. Follow Peter Baker on Twitter at PeterBakerNet.